Hello everybody, welcome to State and Revolution, the book written by Vladimir Lenin in 1917. I am here doing Chapter 3, Part 3s 4 and 5, Parts 3, 4, and 5. We covered Chapter 3, Parts 1 and 2 in the last video. Now we're covering 3, 4, and 5. And Lenin is going to continue laying out how the workers can seize the state and how they can turn it into an apparatus that works for them rather than one that works for their oppression. So Chapter 3, Part 3 is called The Destruction of Parliamentarism. So Lenin's going to talk about specifically here how the workers should go about overthrowing a parliamentary government. So I should explain quick for Americans especially who don't know what a parliamentary system is. It's a system of government where you have legislative, executive, and judicial branches, but the legislative branch has the most power. So political parties are elected to legislature, and a leader of their party takes the executive role. So the easiest way for Americans to think about this, at least for me, is the UK. So in the UK, they have their parliamentary elections. They vote for their MPs, right? Their members of parliament is what MP stands for. And there are parties like the Labour Party and the Tory Party who run candidates for MP, for members of parliament. And then they have a leader of their party. And whoever gets the majority in parliament, the leader of that party becomes the PM, the prime minister. So the Tories won the majority of parliament. So Boris Johnson became the PM then rather than Jeremy Corbyn. And it's very party based. You know, Jeremy Corbyn wrote the Labour Manifesto. And when he wrote that, it was kind of like, all right, this is like the accepted platform of our party now. So it's different from the US. But Lenin's going to talk about these being the forgotten words of Marx here again. Like these, everyone forgets Marx's critique of parliamentarism and what he wrote about how the workers can seize parliament. So I'm going to read this on chapter 30 or page 39 here from Marx right at the beginning of the paragraph. The commune, says Marx, was to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. Instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to represent the people in parliament, universal suffrage was to serve the people, constituted in communes as individual suffrage serves every other employer in the search for the workmen and managers of his business. Now Lenin's going to give a critique here and say Marx is critiquing anarchism. And it's important to remember, I think they're mostly talking about anarchists at the time, because this was a very specific book written for 1917. So he's going to say some things about anarchism and Anarcho-Syndicalism that I think he's relating to his contemporaries at the time that maybe aren't as universally applicable today. Especially he says some things about Anarcho-Syndicalism, which is basically workers taking power through trade unions, which I think is probably going to be essential in any first world socialism movement. Like here in America, we're going to need a strong trade union movement. We're going to need to combine some of these teachings that Lenin gave us with some of the anarcho-syndicalist and even just anarchist thinkers in general. You know, some of it I think is kind of hogwash, but a lot of what anarchists have to say I think can give us things to learn how to implement socialism in the modern world. Because of course, you know, Lenin implemented socialism in Russia, but ultimately we failed to do so. So Lenin says Marx gives a critique of anarchists, and he says people at the time are saying only anarchists critique the government. You know, Marxists want the government to do everything. Socialism is when the government does stuff, right? And Lenin says there are too many people supporting anarcho-syndicalism, which he says is just opportunism. It's just the workers not wanting to destroy the system, just make themselves more money. And not covering in detail, but basically I'm not going to cover it in detail, I wrote, but it's basically a decentralized industrial approach to revolution. I already kind of explained that. So Lenin actually says, Marx said we should use the parliament when the situation isn't revolutionary. But to understand that parliament only serves for us to elect which member of the ruling class we want oppressing us. So basically saying vote, especially if you have someone like, you know, maybe Bernie Sanders, or he's thinking at the time if there's a communist party running in parliament, you should vote for them, but understand voting is not what's going to get you out of capitalism, right? Parliament eventually needs to be seized. So how does the proletariat do away with parliament, this bureaucracy of the state? Lenin says we need to go back to, again, Marx's forgotten or misconstrued arguments that came after the Paris Commune. So he says, the way out is not to abolish representation, but to convert representation from talking shops into working bodies. So Lenin says in parliamentary countries, the parliament only exists to distract the populace as the state functions behind the scenes. So I'm less familiar with UK politics, unfortunately, so I can't give too many specific examples. But basically, they're just there to distract you from your own interests. I can think, all the smears that were made against Jeremy Corbyn, right? Mostly about, personal attacks. He's a racist. He's an anti-Semite, despite the fact that he's got a long history, of standing with oppressed Jewish people because he's pro-Palestine. They try and smear him as an anti-Semite. Parliament serves as a talking shop, just distract the people. This guy's who's standing up for your interests is racist, and he supports human rights abusers. And these people over here who are corporatists are actually the good guys, and they have your interests in mind. And it's just political theater, right? In the U.S., it's not parliamentary, but we think of folks like Pete Buttigieg, right? This is liberal democracy, so it's a little different, but same concept. His only job is to stand up there and tell you can't have Medicare for all. It can't work. He's nothing but a talking head for the insurance industry. And this is what electoral politics are under capitalism. So they're saying these need to be seized and turned into bodies that by the workers for the workers. Now, Lenin actually critiques the Soviets at the time and says the Soviets, these Russian municipal councils, were talking shops, and they weren't workers' bodies. They needed to be transformed in order to have true proletarian democracy. You need decentralized institutions where the workers are making decisions that influence them. Now, you can look at the Soviet Union and the bureaucracy it became, as they defeated the Nazis, and then the Cold War ensued. They developed this huge bureaucracy and military. And you could say they failed at this, and this is part of the reason they collapsed. And that was one of the arguments that Che Guevara made, and why he was so pro-China and Mao, was he thought they were truly, implementing workers' bodies and workers' democracy. And then I would say in the 21st century, the best example of this is the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. Of course, they're being starved out, and of course, they're overly oil dependent because Western corporations have been extracting oil. But they have 2,000 communes where workers meet on a weekly basis and make production decisions. What kind of food are we going to grow? What kind of hours are we going to work? It's this proletarian democracy where they're making decisions for the whole. And the idea is that you need to build socialism, right, out of capitalism. And Lenin says Marx is not utopian. He doesn't imagine a new society, but he studies it as a process of history, seeing the birth of new society from the old. He changes his theories on the commune based off what he learned to move from current society to one without universaldom is utopian, but breaking apart the current state and building a new one, which will allow us to move away from officialdom, is what the commune showed us was possible. So you're not going to people always say, under communism, who's going to do the hard jobs? Or under communism, how are you going to get anybody to be motivated and work? But Marx isn't saying tomorrow we establish a commune, right? You build the new system out of capitalism. You implement these communes funded by the state with all these social programs, and you build worker democracy into the people's brains, and you get them to start thinking differently, and you start to create a new system out of the old, one where power is transferred from small groups of private bodies into the masses. But in order to win the masses and get them to actually have a revolution or push for any kind of new system, you need to show them that the system's actually going to be different, right? That it's going to be one that works for them, which is what the main critique of existing socialism has been, is that it just turns into state capitalism. It's just the same thing as socialism of the past. It's just the same thing as capitalism, only the government's running it rather than private entities. But what people ignore is, one, that even in the Soviet Union, they built all these hospitals, they built all these education centers, they taught everyone to read, they turned the country from an agrarian society, into a world superpower using central planning. And Cuba built hospitals and taught their entire population to read using central planning. Now, this isn't socialism. Like I said, socialism is a process where we build these workers' councils and we look to break apart the state and build in something new. And all these countries have, of course, found themselves under the boot of imperialism and have been combating imperialism, which has caused China to go in the direction of opening up, their consumer markets while keeping their state and industry nationalized. These are all techniques that socialist countries have used in order to combat imperialism and combat being crushed. But when I look at, is it real socialism, this is what I look at. Are they creating proletarian democracy, right? Do they have dictatorship of the proletariat? Are the workers in charge? And of course, we could have an in-depth argument about that when it comes to all these countries. So yeah. So Lenin says capitalism made a situation where the state isn't needed. We don't need lords ruling over us and determining production the same way that we did in feudal society. All right, capitalism does that itself. You just wake up and go to work every day. These institutions for production are already in place. We're already producing. So if we keep the current system going, we can survive. But now we need to transfer the current system and give the parasites of the system, the capitalists who sit atop doing zero work, absolutely useless to the production process, but collecting all of the wealth and then deciding how production is carried out in order so that they can make as much money as they can in a market, right? And we want to transfer to a system where production is carried out based on what benefits the workers, right? And these institutions are already in place. You know, we already have factories and everything we need to produce. But they need to be changed. The infrastructure can be kept, but they need to be transferred to the workers. The power needs to be transferred to the workers. And then if you look at the climate crisis, there's also things that need to happen. Like we need to nationalize the entire energy sector and essentially squash fossil fuels as we create all these good new paying jobs in green energy. That's not going to be done as long as the Koch brothers and whoever else, control industry. That needs to, industry needs to be transferred into the hands of the workers so they can say, okay, let's look at not only what our profit motive is here, but what's our motive for taking care of the planet and what's the motive for taking care of our families. And then workers can, if workers determine production, they can move it to a system of production that is sustainable with humanity or with the environment, which we know is possible thanks to books like Facing the Anthropocene. There's tons of sustainability textbooks, tons of great research on this. But production needs to be organized so that the workers are deciding what's done, so it's done for the benefit of the masses, not for the enrichment of finance capitalists. I mean, and everyone has their critiques of China, but China has planted a forest literally the size of the country of Ireland, and they have multiple fully sustainable eco-cities that they're building because they can plan production. It's not to say China's abolished wage labor. That's not to say they're a completely socialist country where workers completely own the means of production. But they do have a dictatorship of the proletariat, 90 million members of the Communist Party who have control over their industry and banks, and they can use it to build hospitals in a pandemic or, eco-cities or sustainability. And in the US, we have dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, so all we do is just go to war to expand, the capital of finance capitalists. So Lenin says anarchists want to jump straight to the utopia, which human nature... when human nature is different and when humans cooperate. And Lenin says Marxism seeks to create socialism with human nature as it is now, with the shared desire of workers to not be exploited, right? So anarchism's like we all need to share. It makes more sense that way. And Marxism says, well, look at how the conditions are now. You have the exploited masses versus the exploiters. So human nature now, you just need to tell the exploited masses that they should take the means of production for themselves. And that's the key to building a stateless, classless society. And like I said, I've had people critique this as a straw man of anarchism, and anarchism has a bunch of traditions, but this is the basic Marxist-Leninist critique of anarchism. So workers can organize production themselves because who knows production better than those who do it? And there have been studies that show that most innovation happens closest to the work, because of course it does. Shareholders don't know anything about how to tweak something on an assembly line to make it better. The workers who work on that assembly line do. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but we've just been brainwashed into thinking people, Wall Street investors are the smartest people in the world who just have this level of brain power. Us masses, us working people can't even understand. Like the movie the show Shark Tank I wrote. So Lenin becomes a motivational speaker here quick, and he says, it's the duty of the proles to carry out revolution, wither bureaucracy, and create a new order, abolishing wage slavery. Says the workers should hire bookkeepers and managers, not the other way around. Bookkeepers and managers should be hired by the workers, right? They shouldn't be hired by the ruling class to make sure that their profits are constantly expanding. They shouldn't be hiring accountants to be like, hey, look how we can cut the workers' wages in order to give you more profits. The workers should be hiring accountants to say, hey, we can give, I don't know, Jimmy more money, or we can put, more production into this, and we can make more food, or whatever else. So yeah, he says everything should function like the post office did at the time, when workers, managers, and technicians were working side by side. And I guess I'm not an expert on the Russian post office in the early 1900s, but apparently Lenin thought it was a good model for what a early socialist enterprise should look like. So you free up so much when you eliminate the parasitic effect of the bourgeoisie, this class that essentially does nothing except for move capital around and invest in new stocks, but consume at an absolutely ridiculous amount, millions of dollars living lives of luxury compared to those who are doing the actual work, who receive the scraps. And this is the basic thing that's wrong at the core of capitalism. It's a system that constantly increases its wealth without decreasing its misery. So part 4 now, moving on from part 3, the organization of national unity. So he's going to talk about, American socialism. You hear people say a lot now, socialism with American characteristics. How will national unity or patriotism that exists in basically every country function under socialism? So Marx says the commune had little time to answer this question, but what holds a nation or country together after the revolution... Oh shoot, I have read Marx on page 44. One sec here. Pulling up page 44. Read this, it says. Okay, we'll read it. The few but important functions which still would remain for a central government were not to be suppressed, as had been initially misstated, but were to be discharged by the communal and therefore strictly responsible agents. The unity of the nation was not to be broken, but on the contrary to be organized by the communal constitution and to become a reality for the destruction of the state power, which claimed to be the embodiment of the unity independent of and superior to it. The nation itself, from which it was a parasitic extra sense, meaning the state was parasitic of national unity, while the merely repressive organs of the old governmental power were to be amputated. Its legitimate functions were to be wrestled from an authority usurping preeminence over society itself and restored to the responsible agents of society. So the state claims that national unity or patriotism, or the state takes national unity and patriotism and turns it into what they want. So this is a really, really interesting line here from Marx, especially if you look at the modern United States, because 100% patriotism is used to get people to support imperialism, right? America's the best, American chauvinism. We go across the world and we spread democracy. Other countries rely on us to go in with our military and spread democracy to them. And we're just the best. We're America. We protect people. Greatest country in the world. If you don't like it, leave. I mean, patriotism has become what the state apparatus, which protects the ruling class, wants it to become, and what the ruling class wanted to become, which is pro-capitalist, pro-wealth inequality, imperialist, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But under that, there's also a unity between working people, right? If you listen to country music, it's all about working hard and being a good person, and that's kind of what I think patriotism should be, right? The national unity between the proletariat that becomes distorted by the culture that's created under capitalism, when you have a ruling class who's trying to trick all the masses into selling their labor every day in order to maintain the system. Things like patriotism get morphed into these ugly things where you have people supporting the bombing of Muslim people overseas and whatnot. So Marx says purely repressive bodies should be amputated. And I would say this is like the 1,000 military bases overseas, or like the private prisons, or the K9 unit whose only job is to sniff drugs on people, things like that. Purely oppressive bodies just need to be amputated. Get rid of them. They're purely oppressive. They serve no function for the people. Lenin critiques Edward Bernstein, who compared Marx to Proudhon, saying their desired systems were the same. Lenin says no, because Marx advocates for the destruction of the state machinery. And you can argue who was right here. Of course, we mentioned Lenin and Marx didn't predict that all the capitalists, or how good the capitalists would get at crushing socialist experiments, right? So what I'm saying is basically the state didn't wither, right? Lenin's theory that the state was, the proles would seize power and then the state would wither was wrong. And, 30% of the Soviets' funding was spent on military, and this was because they were invaded 7 times after the revolution, and then we obviously had the Cold War, which is widely talked about, where the U.S. did everything they could to crush communism, and this involved murderous actions in any state that would raise up proletarian, who tried to create an alternative economic system to capitalism, and who tried to move the means of production into the hands of the workers. The U.S. would come in and start crushing them, and, Nicaragua was the perfect example. The Sandinistas on day one wanted to give everything back to the factories, give the factories over to the workers, and then a different faction of the Sandinistas said, no, we're going to have to centralize and militarize because the U.S. is going to come kill us. And then you had the Contras, these right-wing paramilitary death squads who ravaged Nicaragua and did everything they could to stop them from developing socialism and developing themselves, and they funded their operations by the CIA facilitating the sale of cocaine in Los Angeles to Rick Ross. So they also filled black neighborhoods with drugs, which helped them keep a boot on the proletariat here at home. So these are some of the ways that Lenin was wrong, and the state actually grew to large sizes post-socialism. And which is why I think Bernstein's analysis can be useful too. I think he was mostly wrong compared to Lenin, but some of the things Bernstein said about a slower transition to socialism and using democratic processes to achieve socialism, I think there is some truth in there. Yeah. So on my last page of notes here, the struggle continues is what I wrote. So you don't just stop trying to create socialism, right, because we got some things wrong. Like Marx got some things wrong, or changed some things after the events of the Paris Commune, after the events of the Soviet Union and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the Venezuelan socialist experiment in Vietnam. We look at these things, in China, of course. And we see what we like that they're doing, what they're doing wrong, and then we look at the material conditions of where we live and how can that be implemented here to make life better. And we change our theories throughout time, which I think is something Marxists have kind of been failing to do. We're kind of, clinging to our ideologies. I'm Marxist-Leninist. I'm Anarcho-Syndicalist. I'm ANCOM. It's like, well, let's just be Marxist with, and try and implement Marxism in whatever country you live in. So I guess I'm Marxist-Americanist, and people have been talking now about Marxism with American characteristics, and I do think that's a good thing. So we'll skip over the Proudhon, we can talk about Proudhon a little more. Lenin says Marx and Proudhon actually agree on the destruction of the state machinery, unlike social democrats, who Lenin calls opportunists. Where they disagree, Marx and Proudhon, is centralism. Marx is a centralist, which Lenin says is more pragmatic, kind of like what we talked about with the Sandinistas. And it really turned out to be pragmatic for the USSR when they had to industrialize quickly or be overthrown by Hitler. So they really had to be centralized and industrialize their country and build up their army. Otherwise, they would have been wiped out by the Nazis. And Marx says you need centralism at first, but to take the path, but in order to take the capital from your country's bourgeoisie. So like in America, we would need to be centralized, as in, like I was talking about earlier, we need to nationalize the energy sector. You need to be centralized in that we need to take the Koch brothers' money, or their means of production, and say, these are the people's now. You guys have been destroying the planet and lobbying for endless war, and you have an extremely exploitative business model where you're collecting millions and millions in profit, living lives of luxury, and you just hand it off to your kids while your workers are in atrocious conditions. Yes. So moving on to number 5, or part 5. This is just a little wrap up here. The destruction of the parasitic state. So Marx says new historical creations are often mistaken for the old. Kind of reminds me of people saying that China isn't socialist at all. They're mistaking it for the old creations of the USSR and state capitalism, when it's really, really quite different if you look in depth at what's going on there. And people said the commune was a reproduction of feudalism at the time, but Marx said it was not, because the parasitic functions of the state were to be removed, and centralized bodies were to be under worker control rather than capitalist control. Whereas feudalism, the nobility, worked for the enrichment of themselves and the enrichment of the powerful. Under the Paris Commune, the armed bodies were to work in favor of the working class and to be controlled by the working class through decentralized municipal councils, which have been really hard to implement when the CIA is ravaging and torturing and killing everybody in your country where you're trying to implement socialism. But they have done it in Venezuela. They really have. So please watch Venezuela's Commune. Still here, still fighting. Great video. But anyways, he says what made the commune different from all our other forms of government was that it was a working class government produced by the struggle of the exploited versus the exploiters. So scientific socialism, a new socialism coming out of a new system coming from the struggle between exploited and exploiters. This is how new modes of production are created and society becomes better. So in the U.S., you had people struggling against slavery. The union, the shareholders, and sharecroppers and the slaves themselves fought against the plantation owners and the Confederacy, which was a state apparatus designed to continue the economic mode of production that was slavery. Replace it with capitalism, something better. And now what's better than capitalism? Socialism. So Marx doesn't predict future political forms, as many people say that he does, people who haven't read Marx. Doesn't predict future political forms, but he says they'll be produced and altered as needed, but needs to be under rule of the proletariat, the working masses. So that's the key, right? Marx was not specific about what socialism would look like. He said it would look different in the countries where it pops up. But the key is that your dictatorship of the proletariat. The working class must remain in charge, which this is my main critique of China. It seems like I've been praising China. They risk with having such, so many billionaires and such a bourgeoisie existent in their country, they risk losing that dictatorship of the proletariat, right? The bourgeoisie grows to too much strength. Maybe the U.S. is heavily backing them. I don't know. The U.S. is trying to destabilize China right now. Maybe they're successful, and the bourgeoisie takes over. That's the main. That would make the form of government go back to capitalism, according to Marx, right? What you need is proletarian rule if you want to get to a new economic system, because that's scientific socialism. The exploited masses are the ones who need to create the new system. It can't come from the top down, because the bourgeoisie is going to look out for their own economic interests. So the commune was a failed attempt to liberate humans. But we look at it and learn. We don't stop trying to liberate the masses because we made mistakes. We must learn from the past and continue the struggle. Boom. If there's one thing that I want you to get from State and Revolution, it's that Lenin and Marx are tracing the experiments of the past, looking at where they went right and where they went wrong, and they're trying to use that to learn about what they can do in the future, which I think is what we should be doing all the time. Everything we learn and think about, we should be thinking how we can implement this to do better in the future. How can we implement a socialism that will truly liberate humans more so than even just what we've done so far with building hospitals and electrifying places through central planning, and actually looking to abolish wage slavery and move to a new mode of production where the workers are dominant on a global scale, right? Not socialism over here and capitalism over here, and capitalism's trying to crush them. Proletarian rule everywhere. Which I think can only happen by overthrowing the state apparatus. But anyways, that's Vladimir Lenin's Chapter 3, Parts 2 through 5. I hope you enjoyed. We'll be moving on to Chapter 4, which means I have to reread Chapter 4, so it might be a little bit. Takes a while to read these, and then usually after I spend 5-6 hours reading and taking notes, I don't necessarily just want to jump on camera and film. So I wait a little bit, let it sink in, reread it again, blah, blah, blah. All right, thanks for sticking around, everyone. Peace out. We'll see you next time.